This presentation has got a lot of details in it, and I'm not going to try to cover all of them in detail, so I'm hoping that will inspire your questions. All right. By the way, my title there is a joke. It was given to me by somebody else, and I didn't care what my title was, so I've always kept it. Just for your information. And I want to preface this by saying that I will try to give you a feel of the arcade industry, because most of you were not around in the early 1980s to 85 to really know what it was like. And I also want to preface this by saying it's been 26 years since I've worked on Gauntlet, so I've forgotten a lot of things. and more to that, when I left Atari, I left all my notes behind. So I had a hard time trying to resurrect everything here. So anything that I say is wrong or I omitted is probably unintentional. And just to give you some feedback, some history, I joined Atari in February 1978, and after getting in trouble with many of my employers for doing games and other things on the side that I shouldn't have been doing, but I won't go into all the stories now. Atari was located in Sunnyvale, right across from where I was working at Control Data, before we moved to Milpitas a few years later. And just for your information, I listed some of the games I had done, including Super Breakout, Asteroids, Centipede, Video Pinball, Millipede, Gauntlet, and Gauntlet 2, and Steel Talons, iBots, etc. I've also done VCS cartridges. That was on the side, by the way. My boss did not know about that when I released it. In fact, he caught me the day I was making a patch to the ROMs after they found a bug, and he asked me, "What are you doing? Getting in trouble again?" Anyway, I left Atari in 1992 to go to EA, the other evil empire, I guess. But I was there for about 18 months before I decided, I went there to do consumer games, and I didn't do any consumer games. They wanted me to do coin-op stuff before they finally decided coin-op was not going to work. I could have told them that, but anyway. After that, I left to do consumer games as I intended, and I included N64 titles of Wayne Gretzky, San Francisco Rush, Rush 2, Rush 2049, which was also on the Dreamcast, by the way, and Dr. Mito, which was on 3 different consoles. And I was actually the last Atari engineer out the door in Milpitas when they shut us down. So unfortunately, I had to see it all come and go over the entire many years. Just to give you some interesting information on the coin-op industry, this is a really different industry that you're probably used to, because you can do a game, but we actually put it on field test, and if it doesn't get enough quarters, it's as good as dead. And it's really, consider that is a pure test of your game. There's no marketing hype, no promotion, no nothing. And quite honestly, I suspect about 60% of our games didn't even make it past field test. And even those that did, I would probably guess 10% of them were probably hits and sufficient sales numbers to actually make it profitable. And quite honestly, some of mine did not succeed either. In fact, I even killed a few, and some I couldn't kill no matter what I tried to do. Marketing went, "Oh, just try this. Oh, just try that." Doesn't help. And I have this motto of, what you see on your first field test, unless there's something really bad, is pretty much what you're going to get. But nobody ever listened to me. The industry is really different than the consumer industry. We sell to distributors, and there's usually 1 or 2 per general area. And the distributors turn around and sell to the operators, people that actually have the arcades or send the games around to their street locations. And the operators collect all the money, and the distributors are there just to finance the operators, to fix the games, and provide whatever services we don't provide to the operators. And for the record, neither Atari nor I got any drop of the coin box. So all those quarters put in, thank you, but I didn't get any of them. So just think about that. The industry had changed dramatically when I joined in '78, because a hit game like Super Breakout was maybe 10,000 units, and that was a really good game. And then by 1979, things like Space Invaders and Asteroids came around. Space Invaders, I heard numbers like 300,000. I mean, it was so bad in Japan, there was a national shortage of yen because all the games were basically taken up. Can you imagine all the quarters in the US being in video games, and you couldn't get quarters to do your laundry? That's how bad it was. In 1981, there was Centipede, again, about 65,000 units. Asteroids, I think, was about 70,000. Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man probably sold in the 90 to 100,000 units each. And then 1983 came along and the Atari consumer collapsed. And I won't go into the details of that, but it did affect the coin-op industry. We were like 3 buildings and they were out of 34 at Atari. So that shows you the difference between the coin-op industry versus the consumer industry at Atari. But because of that, in 1984, Atari was split into 2 companies, Atari Inc. and Atari Games. So people have to come, oh yes, I played Ataris. They're talking about a VCS. I had nothing to do with this, folks. I'm not even in the same company, or the Atari 800 or the ST or whatever. But we actually had our first layoffs in 1984 because our industry really hit the skids. And what happened here was that basically we oversaturated the market. We sold games to every arcade. Operators, put games into doctors and dentists' office simply because they could. And then, there were games everywhere and there was no place to put new games. So the market really collapsed in '84 for us and we had our first layoffs. And because of the layoffs and everything else, Atari was actually sold, or 51% of it was sold to Namco in 1985. Now, in 1978, most of the business was arcades. We had street locations, but by 1983, the street locations were really the majority of the sales. You could probably sell 20,000 maybe to an arcade, but the rest of it, the extra 70, 80,000 had to go to street locations. And the street locations, by 1985, basically you didn't sell anything into them. It was all used games. And the reason for that is the street operators actually split the earnings from the game with the location. So if you earned $100 a week, the operator would get 50 and the guy who owned the location would get 50 bucks. So it was very hard to get a return on investment for a game that you probably paid $2,500 for. You just do the math, it takes a long time to get return on investment with that. A lot of people have asked me how did some of these game ideas come about, and primarily 3 ways. We had brainstorming sessions, once a year where we got together and just talked about whatever ideas we could come up with. And generally, I did not find them very useful, but one game did come out of that. I had a new hire and I wanted to give her a project, and so I picked a game called Bug Shooter and it turned into Centipede. But that's one of the only game ideas I ever got out of the brainstorming session. Managers also had ideas that would come to me and say, I had this idea for a game, and that's how Asteroids came about. There's a lot of rains came to me and say, I got this idea for a game. And a lot of times we come up with our own ideas, and that's how Gauntlet came about. I'm going to explain a little bit later where the ideas came about, but Zybots, for example, was a game that I was thinking about Doom, and I said, we don't have bitmap hardware, but I bet you I can do a first-person shooter like that using just stamps. And so that's how Zybots came about. It was just to prove to myself I could do a game like that using stamp hardware. So that's some idea where the games came from. Now, about Gauntlet, my son had been playing D&D for a long time, and he wanted me to do a D&D game. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out how to do it. So I've been thinking about it for a year, and I thought, how can I do a D&D game? And then I played Dandy on the Atari 800, and sort of, the bells went off and said, I know how I can do it. So we actually started a design in September 30th of 1983. So this is when Robin Ziegler and I actually did a design for Gauntlet. And for those of you who are not familiar with Dandy, this is what Dandy looked like. The players, you had up to 4 players, and usually the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you'll see on the screen in there, it's a 1-player game, and 1 is sitting right in the middle. The nice thing about it, or the great idea I got out of this game was the monster generators, and I thought that was really interesting. It had keys and doors and treasure, which would happen with any D&D game anyway. Here was actually the first game design document that we did. I won't pull it out, it's actually quite large. It has very interesting pictures of all the playfields, standard D&D pieces that are kits you use together and build playfields. But the important thing to look at this was the date on that. We actually did a design, and about a couple months later we actually had a marketing review, and they sort of said, yeah, go ahead, do it. This was our first proof that we could do characters, and this was actually dated January of 1984, just prior to that review. This particular, it was in color, but I no longer had access to the original artwork. This was a Xerox copy of a Xerox copy that I had done long ago. But it was just our first proof of concept. So you can see already what the characters looked like back in basically 83 and early 84. These in particular ones were medium res, and I'll get into that more later because the game was actually not a medium res game at all. One thing you do realize when you look this over is the names of the games change. So if I refer to the Hulk sometime in here, it's really the Warrior, or the same with the Valkyrie. It was in the Amazon, so I'll probably intertwine those two in the game. And I can't tell you why the names changed. I can't even for the life of me think why it changed. But somehow, somewhere along the line, they did change. Now, the coin-op industry itself in 1985 was in a tough boat because everything was 25 cents per play. Now, you expected to play 90 to 2 minutes, 3 minutes at tops, but there was extremely large resistance. If you put a game out of 50-cent play, man, that was a kiss of death. That would kill a game so fast. And the dollar coin, of course, had been tried, and that had failed miserably. Everybody had hoped that the dollar coin would induce multiple plays and it would work, but it did not work. So the question came out of how do you get extra earnings out of a game? Because as the game hardware got more expensive, you need to make more money, et cetera, et cetera. So how are we going to do this? Well, here this game came along and sort of, eureka, everything works. Not only that, I can get 4 players to play at the same time. So basically, they're playing for $1 for 2 minutes. Now that's 4 times better than any other game out there, except games like Rip-Off and stuff where you get 2 players simultaneous. But this is really revolutionary idea that sort of hit home for me. And there's some other really good parts of it too, because players can come and go at any time, so you're basically always having 4 players playing. You don't have this, 1 player and then a few players die off, and then you have to wait for everybody to die off before you join in. That's no longer necessary. And there was no dead time at the start of a game, which you usually bring up the game very slowly, sort of say, this is how to do this is how to do that. You don't have to do that anymore. People can hop right in, and if you don't know by now, then you'll die soon enough. Or everybody will tell you how to do it, which is usually what happens. And what really was interesting in this game, players put in more than 1 coin at a time, and that was really unusual for the time. Now, we had a lot of problems with design issues up front, partly because of the differences of opinion between myself and Robin Ziegler. We went through, of course, the horizontal vertical monitor, which way do you want to do it? There were a lot of reasons, and I won't go into them all the details here, whether we should do interlaced video or non-interlaced video. Everything at this point was non-interlaced video. I have a real problem with interlaced video when you're standing this close to a monitor because the flicker just drives me nuts. So I really did not want to do interlaced video, but it would make things look a little better. Medium res was coming into vogue at the time, and there was really a large push to do it, but operators are really sensitive to money. And to add a medium res game, you're adding about $300 to the hardware, plus another, well, at least $300 to the hardware, and additional ROMs and stuff like that. Also at this time, they were just coming into 25-inch monitors. 19-inch was standard, and 25-inch monitors were $100, and reliability was not there yet. So all the way through the project, right up to the first field test, it was supposed to be a 25-inch monitor, but the game actually shipped with a 19-inch. We had other things coming along, like the personal memory device. Marketing was saying, here, we want to sell these to every player. They can get customization, they can plug it into the game. And I took one look at that and said, no way, man. First time bubble gum, stick it in the hole. PMD is deader than doornail. Besides, who's going to pay $10 for something that not every game in the world has? Because unless everybody has it, nobody's going to do it. So that one died. And I actually had a large fight with my boss over that because he really wanted to push it. Now, in those days, I'd been doing 6502 programming all the way up till late 1984. So this was my first time I'd actually done C programming using a processor other than a 6502. It wasn't new to Atari, but it was new to me. And we were using a VAX mainframe to do all our cross compiles and our X terminals or our VT100s for our terminals at that point. And that was actually new to me too. The strange thing was, people say, oh, I got this 8 megahertz processor, and that's so much better than my 1 megahertz 6502. No, it's not. It's 8 cycles per instruction, buddy, and a 68010. So it's basically the same speed as a 6502. So all you got's bigger registers. You don't really have anything much better. So this is where I get hit with the old megahertz syndrome. Oh, I got more megahertz. Nope. 6502 is 1 cycle for a lot of instructions, guy. I can still run circles around it if you do 8-bit math. There was also, we used the Green Hills compiler at that time. And I don't think for this project, but later on I actually wrote a post-compiler that would take the Green Hills output and basically delete about 20% of the instructions, because we always ran at 60 hertz. And if we didn't run at 60 hertz, boy, your reputation was shot. So we wanted to get everything we could out of it. And really, a 1 megahertz processor is not a lot of horsepower when you want to do things at 60 hertz. It basically gives you 16 milliseconds to do everything. Now, Gauntlet had a lot of motion objects, so I didn't want to spend a lot of time basically moving things around. But standard resolution games at that time were 320 by 240 pixels. It's not a lot compared to what you're probably used to now. We'd actually graduated up to 56 motion objects. That's 56 objects total. So if it wasn't on your scan line, still counted, buddy, even though it wasn't being drawn. Could only draw 56. We actually had 3 layers of graphics. We had the alphanumerics on top, we had a playfield on the bottom, and sprites that could run in between. So those are our sprites or motion objects in between. So those are how we did everything in our game up to that time, and even for a long time thereafter. And all our color was using color palettes. We did not have a 16-bit or a 32-bit color space. It was all color palettes. This was too far. System 1 board was the board of choice about 1984. It was a new system they were putting together. And it had a 6502 that was running about twice the speed of what the Gauntlet finally showed up with. Standard resolution, the 56 motion, the same alphanumeric playfield, scrolling playfield, color palettes that I just mentioned, and everything else. It had an extensive audio system that far beyond what I'd been used to before. It had a separate processor to run it, and you had a FM synthesis. We had a Pokey chip, which was the same chip that used the audio for the Atari 800, 400, if you're familiar with that. And it was primarily there not only for sound effects, but it was for security, because anybody who wanted to copy our game, they had to go find our custom chip. And so often what they do is they go and buy an 800, tear it apart, and just pull out the chip just to copy our board. That showed you how desperate they were. And we actually had a speech chip for the first time. So this is the very first time that I actually had a speech chip. And this is, again, as I said, by far the most elaborate hardware that we had. Again, when we get to Gauntlet hardware, it's pretty much the same, but I had to have, I wanted to do 1,000 motion objects. So I wanted to add a lot more to it, which meant we needed to add a lot to the hardware board. To give you some idea, I'll get into more of this later. The designed hardware was huge. The System 1 board is a 18-inch by 18-inch motherboard with a 10 by 18-inch cartridge board where you put all your EEPROMs and game-specific stuff. And so it was going to be huge. But our final board actually came out considerably smaller, and I'll explain why. But this is a System 1 board. So it's about 28, that's almost 28 by 20 inches. And we need to expand that, and we needed to actually mount it on the inside of a cabinet, which was going to be a real trick. We didn't know how to do that. But this is the final Gauntlet board. It's less than 21 inches long and about 11 and a half inches tall. And it's, as you see, it's tightly packed. And the way we did that is we went to a 4-layer board. And this is the first time Atari had even considered it. I got a lot of flack for suggesting it because the price for a blank PC board was almost twice what a two-layer board was, but we didn't have any other way. There were other problems too. Our CAD system couldn't lay it out. I mean, you were trying to put two traces between pins on an IC, and it's like, we don't have software to do that. So they eventually had to resolve that. We also had, our manufacturing facility had auto insertion tools, and the auto insertion wouldn't work in some places on the board because we actually had to get smaller resistors and things to actually fit. So there were a lot of manufacturing problems with this too. But once we resolved those, all our boards after Gauntlet were done as four-layer boards. So we sort of pioneered that as far as manufacturing goes. As I mentioned, we started this in 1983, but the game didn't actually come out until like October of 1985. So, of course, what happened? Well, there were layoffs, and we lost Robin Ziegler. My hardware engineer was supposed to do my hardware, got stuck on Temple of Doom, and for all of '84, I basically had no hardware engineer. And then they asked me to do a game in between. Of course, I couldn't do Gauntlet, so I ended up doing Roadrunner as a video disc game. But come late '84, they said, well, after many field tests, by the way, it was not bad enough to kill it, not good enough to ship it. They said, we want you to convert it to System 1. And I said, no way. Get somebody else to do that. I have another game in mind. And so that's when I went and started work on Gauntlet. So if you see the Roadrunner Visitor Disc game, that's a real rare thing. There's probably somebody with a copy of the disc. It actually had real Chuck Jones cartoons, by the way. So in February of 1985, we actually started Gauntlet again. At that point, Pat McCarthy was the engineer, and he actually started designing the board. And Bob Flanagan joined me as the other software engineer. And I took over as project leader from Chris Downen in March of '85. So here's the development team. So you'll notice it's about 2 programmers. I got 4 artists, 4 or 5 artists, 1 engineer, 1 technician part-time, and I had 3 audio people working on the game also part-time. So this would be a fairly large project for CoinUp at that time. And as you mentioned, as I may have mentioned, the game, or if you noticed on that first slide I showed you, the game name actually has changed quite a bit. It was originally called Dungeons. And if you actually go and look at the source code, you'll find it's in a folder called D&D. And unfortunately, in April of '85, we did the name search, and lawyers came back and said, can't use Dungeons. So for a few weeks, I madly pulled out game ideas, but I don't remember who suggested Gauntlet, but that was finally decided on May of '85. And I don't have the list of the game names that we actually looked at that time. But Gauntlet really stuck out to me because you can run the Gauntlet, et cetera, et cetera. So it seemed like a really good choice of game, since pretty much that's what the gameplay was you're doing the whole time is running the Gauntlet. Of course, marketing had their problems. I always have fun dealing with marketing. First thing they come up and say, can you get 4 players to play together? I said, sure, no problem. Of course, you're never sure, but it certainly worked for the engineers, and so I don't see why not. They had other problems too. If they said, well, if only would 1 or 2 players play if there's, if you don't have enough for 4, they come up with lots of things to worry about. One thing they did worry about was quite legit was we have coin mechs, and coin mechs jam often. They're often problematic, and we actually stuck 2 coin doors on the game to have 4 coin mechs, 1 per player, because that was the only way we could figure out to equitably distribute the coins, because we talked about, inserting coins and then deciding who gets the coins, and it's like, no, let's keep it simple. You stick it in your coin slot, it's yours. If your coin slot's broken, well, you play a 3-player game. But it took me a long time to get that through. Now, the actual game itself is actually laid out in a 1024 by 1024 pixel world. And that's actually the size of the scrolling playfield that's the RAM for it underneath. So the scrolling registers that we had, I could scroll through that whole universe, and actually I could even wrap around so you could see part of the top and the bottom and left and right and so on. The game was set up so that I would force the players that they couldn't walk off screen, and that's for obvious reasons. You walk off screen, you're going to get lost and you can't get back on, and that's not fair to the players. So I'd always stop the players at the edge of the screen. And I'd always make sure the scrolling was such that you'd try to be as fair as possible depending where the players are. So if one guy wants to run off, then he scrolls everybody over and everybody says, no, stop screwing with us, come over here. So it's part of the competitive, cooperative aspect of the game. The collision algorithm is rather problematic. Again, I couldn't do collision on 1,000 objects moving. Basically, I only moved the objects that were visible that everybody could see. I do not move objects that were off the screen. But I didn't have the compute power to do all those at 60 hertz. So I came up with this elaborate, not so elaborate, this simple method to break the world into 16 by 16 grids. Now, all the characters are really 24 by 24 pixels large, so there's always some overlap. It's okay to have shoulders overlapping or weapons overlapping, that's fine. But basically, it's a 16 by 16 grid, and everybody belongs to one of the grids. So that if you want to move, you only need to check, let's say you want to move right or diagonal upper right, you only need to check a couple neighbors. You only need to worry about a few things. The walls were also part of the object too, so part of the grid so that you could check against walls as well. I also had a method in there for sliding, so if you wanted to move diagonal left, but there was something in the way, you would just turn around and it would actually slide up there. So whether it's a wall or another player, you'll see everything slide in that direction. Shots were a little different, and yeah, you can check with that. But once the object moved, more than 8 or so pixels, you'd reassign it to the, off the center of the grid, you'd assign it to the next grid if it were available. Now, if it were not available, then you wouldn't move. So every now and then you see gaps where things do this, and that's the reason for that. There are times in the game where shots could actually go through diagonals, slots in the wall. Now, some shots are wider than others, so you couldn't shoot through them, so that was quite intentional. And I made it such that differentiate the players that way. The real problem with the hardware was the fact that I only had 56 motion objects I had to display per line. So I need to figure out how to make sure I got the right 56. And the idea was to come up with what we call starting link pointers. And so here was, for every 8 scan lines, I had a pointer that'd say, here's the first object I want you to look at, and all the objects were linked together. And it was through this grid process that I'd link everything together. We also did something very different with this particular hardware, and I'll go ahead and mention it now. Because, as I mentioned earlier, if a motion object was not visible, or a portion was not visible, it still counted as a motion object drawn. And I wanted to better that. And the engineer came up with an idea to sort of do a look ahead. It would look and say, that object's a little low, he's not being drawn. Count it as a half cycle, go to the next object. So you could actually do more than 56 motion objects per scan line using that method. And that was one of the nice features of Gauntlet, because if you've ever seen it every now and then, you'll see things twinkle when there's full of ghosts or something on the screen, and that's the reason why. This is, I can't display more than 56, but there are times when it does happen. And so the starting link pointer and this collision grid are all totally linked. So I had exactly the objects that would be visible in that set of things for that particular set of 8 scan lines. And also the slips were linked to the scrolling playfield. So if I scroll the playfield up and down, they'd be tied to the real playfield. Normal starting link pointers, you have to redo every scan line's link pointers. And I did not have to do that with Gauntlet. It's all saving. It's very easy to do in hardware, just to add the scroll counter to the position. But for the processor side, it was a real saving for me. Now, enemy movement was kind of very simplistic. Basically, you walk to the closest player next to him, and that was for a lot of strategic reasons. You want some guy to act as a decoy so everybody comes to him. Well, I think everybody goes around and shoots them. And that, I think, came from Dandy, and I thought that was very, very nice. Nice aspect of the game. It allows for very cooperative play. Now, controls I thought were fairly simple, and I don't know where I came up with these, if they came from Dandy or if they came from some other game. But basically, you either move or you can shoot. And since I did not want to do a Robotron controls where you have double joysticks, I want to keep it real simple. If you're shooting, you don't move, so you can use the joystick to tell you where you're shooting. Otherwise, you take the hand off the shot button, you can move away. So either stand and shoot, or you get to move. It's a nice strategic choice because you have to decide to do one or the other. And there are certainly reasons for doing so. And of course, Magic was the extra button, which was sort of the super zapper, as it were, if you're familiar with Tempest. We did have a maze editor to deal with all of this stuff. And all of the levels were created. And I went on a 6-week sabbatical right after the first field test. Atari had this wonderful plan for sabbatical, so I took 6 weeks off and took off to Alaska where I couldn't be reached. So Bob Flanagan took over and dealt with the field tests and as well as getting all these levels together. And we actually had 100 levels built up. And I actually had to compress the levels because I didn't have all the extra ROMs. It was a very simple algorithm. But there was somebody who called himself the Orange Elf at one point who sent me a bunch of brand new compressed levels. So he had actually disassembled the code, figured out the algorithm, built his own levels, and reprogrammed the EPROMs, and had his own Gauntlet game with his own set of levels. It's kind of, I thought it was kind of interesting. One of the marketing problems that they had was that there's no end to this game. And everybody's saying, well, you know, what are you going to do? I was going to say, well, I'm not going to kill their quarters. This guy may have put $5-10 in. I'm not going to sell him. Sorry, thank you. That's going to really piss a few people off. So I had a real problem telling marketing, well, this is the way it's going to be. So there was an interesting way to recycle levels. The first 7 levels were just a teaching level to get you through, and after 8 levels and beyond, they were what appeared to be random. They were not random. I had a prime number of levels. I picked some arbitrary starting level. I picked some arbitrary random number between that and the number of levels remaining, and I increment the level number by that number, and that guarantees you can play all the levels. Now, when you get through them all, what I do is start horizontal flipping, vertical flipping, and so they don't quite look the same. They look similar, but not quite the same. So it was a good way of doing that. There were high scores in this game, and I do not remember how they worked, whether it was per coin, because I remember we had large discussions of, well, people are just going to buy their way onto the high score table, putting more coins in and doing this, and I thought I did it as per coin basis, but I don't remember. And so somebody will certainly correct me, I'm sure, at some point. I don't remember who suggested the Dungeon Master, but I wish I knew. I don't even have a list of all the phrases we had together at one point either, but I do know Earl Vickers actually contracted Ernie to do all the voice for us. Now, he's apparently well known. He's done Hardware Wars and a bunch of other titles. I don't know of them, but a lot of people say, oh, yeah, I know him. He did a lot of stuff. But he actually did the voices on Gauntlet, just for your information. We have a security problem in CoinOp because you publish a game, the first time it earns a lot of money, people come in and say, I'll turn around and sell them for half the price and just copy the board as is. And unfortunately, that happened. They did that on Gauntlet, even despite our security purposes. As I mentioned earlier, they went out and ripped off old 400s and 800s and pulled out the Pokey chip. They found a way around our slap chip, which is our security chip. And it was just unfortunate. Now, for your information, I've been called into a lot of cases where we actually went and tried to sue these people, and it was a very interesting story. I mean, in Centipede, for example, I went to looked at the expert's deposition on some game that was copied of Centipede, and the guy said, well, basically, the art looked different, therefore it's a different game. And I dumped the ROMs for their game and my game, and except for a few places, the game ROMs are identical. He just changed the art ROMs. I don't even know if he even changed the Atari logo on the bottom. Well, he probably did. Probably changed the copyright Atari on the bottom of the screen that was in text. So that's probably all he did to the game. So I would have loved to have gone into court and talked to this guy. And a lot of times in the past, we'd actually done software security. And if you remember Tempest, there's something got through that should not have. So if you play to get to a certain score, it'll give you 20 free credits. And that's our software security. So it got broken and got shipped with it. As I mentioned already, we had problems with 1925-inch monitors. There was a real problem with the game because operators had never seen a game before that didn't have an attract-plex or a plexiglass in front of the monitor. And they're, oh man, what are we going to do? And it's like, basically I told them I didn't want it because there's always glare. Every time you put a attract-plex down, there's always glare. And if you got something that's blocking your corner screen, your player is, it's just not fun. So I really had to force them not to put an attract-plex. And actually operators what later came and said, we still want one. So we actually sold them a kit with 8 screws and a piece of plexiglass and said, here, go ahead and do it. So someone did, apparently. There were actually 5 patents issued by Gauntlet, and some of them doing with the cooperative, multiplayer cooperative play, some with the collision algorithm, some with the slips, and also with the look-ahead dealing with the motion object circuit. I won't go into any detail. I see I'm running out of time right now. We often do focus groups, and I really find them almost worthless. The only thing I really take out of focus group is when they ask the game, compare this to your favorite game. I look at that, or the other thing I'll look at is if they come in and they're, oh, let me see this. Okay, that's good. The rest of it, I can throw away. Now here's a sample examples I pull off a focus group. The first one here is for asteroids, who didn't even spell my name right, the game name right. That shows you what they know. And they actually rated asteroids less than Lunar Lander, and, about the same as Lunar Lander, but less than Starship. I don't even remember Starship. That shows you where they're going. And the results actually came back positive on Gauntlet. I could have told them that, but the one thing that did come out of the focus group is they wanted something to, because I don't think I had the first 7 levels in to teach them how all the different things work, and so that was the one thing that came out of the focus group for Gauntlet. I think it was about the only thing that I got out of Gauntlet. Player survey is something we've never done or hardly ever done for games, and we actually went out on our third field test and we asked the players, what do you think of this game? And basically, and I'll quote this is actually a quote from the response, was from the marketing. It says, the player ratings are almost as high as possible. So, and even players admitted putting up to $50 in the game at one session. I don't believe that. I still don't believe that. But it was not worth anything to me, but it was interesting. I guess it was reassuring to marketing more than anything else. Field tests are, as I mentioned, are really different. Now, the way they work is we have an agreement with the operator that says, you keep our game secret, don't tell anybody. We get the, you can keep all the earnings, but tell us how much the game earned and how much every other game in your arcade earned, so we have some idea. And I put Gauntlet out in June of '85. I went out a few days later to check on it. I walk in and here's David Rosen talking to some other executive at Sega and 3 Japanese engineers photographing the game. Oops. So this is the only game I've ever pulled from a field test, just for security reasons. So I had to pull it. And so we didn't do any business with that arcade afterwards, but there was so much buzz in the industry. Normal field tests usually steal earnings from other games in the arcade. That did not happen with Gauntlet, and I'll show you that in a minute. But some of the other numbers up here, if you remember me talking earlier in the flash forward saying this is one of the highest earning games I'd ever seen, and I still think that's true, but there was, we had a field test in San Mateo that had earned $15,000 in 16 weeks. And these guys, I'm sure paid about $3,000 for the game, so that's pretty good ROI. There was actually one guy came up to me in the AMOA in October of '85 and said, oh, shake your hand. My game made $3,500 the first week. I was like, holy crap. I started doing the math. And that means there's 4 players in the game, 24 hours a day. It's like, oh my God. 2 minutes per quarter. I couldn't believe it. I still don't believe it to this day either. Here's a typical field test report that we get. If you notice on the right-hand side, this is our primary test arcade, by the way. This is the game arcade that we almost always put our field test units on. If you notice, in late September, the game was earning $4,500. The whole arcade was making $4,500 that week. Well, if the Gauntlet was putting in, it made $5,700, so it jumped up by $1,200. And if you look at Gauntlet, it was $1,136 the first week. If you look at the closest game next to it, I think it was $186. So that was a typical arcade game earned in those days in '85. Now, again, as I said, you probably paid $2,500 to $3,000 for a game. We have very interesting things. I know I'm running out of time here, so I'm sorry, but these are really interesting things. We actually have to test our games for FCC regulations. We had an anechoic chamber. This is not a picture of ours, by the way, with a round table in the middle of it, so you put a game there and just rotate it. But it was really interesting to go in there, shut the door. You saw no light. It was pitch black. You stand there for a few minutes, maybe, or a few seconds actually, and you start hearing sounds like molecules hitting your ear and your heartbeat. You can hear your heartbeat. It's, a lot of people really get freaked out, but I thought it was really cool. But it was really interesting because we have 4-layer boards. Our board was pretty quiet because normally you have 2-layer boards. Every trace on that board is basically an antenna. So if you're sending a signal down, you got this nice broadcast everywhere. But on 4-layer boards, you have this power and ground planes and shielding it. So it actually came fairly quiet. And so that's why everybody went to 4-layer boards. But this gives you some information on the pricing, because normally what we do is most of our games are like 1995 around that time. But there was a big, all the distributors came and said, oh, no, give it to us at $2,000. We'll sell 5 times as many. I didn't believe them for a minute, but our final price point was $22.95 to the distributors in the U.S. Now, when it went out, of course, every operator in the world wanted to have one right away, and we only built 100 a day. So the distributors were asking premium, so I'm sure they were getting big bucks from some operators to get the first few games. And that's what I heard anyway. I don't know what the operators paid for it. We did ship games. In early October, as I said, we actually shipped games to Japan in '85 as well, and these are our domestic numbers. And I look back at them now and look at the earnings and saying, God, that game should have sold a lot more. I still don't know why it didn't sell more. And maybe the handwriting was on the wall and I just didn't want to see it. But coin op industry was definitely in decline at that point. And this gives you some comparison to what some of the other games were selling. Temple of Doom, we had about 2,800 units. Super Sprint, 2,250 units. That was a medium res, I believe. So the prices were a little higher on that. And I can go into the rest of it, but we did 2 different languages for this. But I've run out of time, so at this point I'd like to open it up for questions. And I'd like everybody, because this session is being recorded, to come to the microphones so that everybody can hear your questions. If you need ideas, I can give you plenty. Fire away, go ahead.
Yeah, there was at some point somebody figured out how to live forever in Gauntlet 1. There was a trick you could pull off in like level 8, and then they released several patches to kind of reduce the ability to playing forever. Were you involved in any of that? Do you remember anything about?
Oh yes, I remember that very well. Now I had done Asteroids, and I won't go into the working story, but I got shit for, leaving a version out that could play forever. And I found people that could play forever on Centipede practically too. So you think I'd have learned, but I didn't. Yes, there was it was firstly reported in Japan seriously, because Japan has a different culture. So when one person come up and was playing the game, in the US you just walk up, drop your coins in and play. In Japan they can walk up and say, may I join you? And the guy says, no, people don't take offense. So the guy would play it as a single-player game, and he could play forever. And it was found that if you played the Hulk or the Wizard, you could play forever. And yes, I did create a patch for it by reducing the amount of food for 1-player and 2-player games. For 3 and 4, I kept all the food out there. And I eventually dropped the amount of food as the game went on. If the guys kept playing and playing and playing, I'd still start dropping food. Yes, I released the ROMs, but I can't tell you how effective it was or how many people actually got it. But I can tell you for Asteroids, when I released the fix for Asteroids, the operators put it in, immediately took it back out. They never used it because they found out that people couldn't play forever and they couldn't lurk. They wouldn't play the game. So there's actually incentive for it. Yes?
Yes, I actually had a question about the effort you put into security to your games. And
yes.
You also mentioned that you'd been an expert witness in copyright lawsuits and things like that. It's a big challenge for our industry, how to deal with that. And as a programmer, I work with programmers that have to spend so much of their time worrying about patents, worrying about, how to make sure that they're protected. And I just wondered if you had any perspective on the current industry as a patent owner and as a programmer.
Well, I have mixed feelings about patents. I can see why they're necessary. And, I think the companies have certainly gotten overboard with them because, everybody's creating patents now. It's basically become a corporate strategy to get patents and sue everybody. And it really hurts, it really hurts the industry in the long run. I don't like it. And, gives the power to the big companies, and I don't like that either. But, I see why it's necessary. And I don't have a good solution for it. Copying is a different matter because people will copy stuff, leave your name in it. They don't, leave your copyright message. They don't care as long as they get the sales for it. And that, that's something really different. And that, I really object to. So I'm not sure I answered your question. Oh. And yes, I spend a lot of time dealing with this stuff. And there's really no good solution. I did things, for example, on Dreamcast for Rush 2049 that I could actually tell when people ripped off the cartridge or ripped off the CD. And when you played, actually, you go to the Sega website and play it. I actually recorded the people that had ripped the CD off, so I could have known who they were. Unfortunately, the software for the guys who ripped it off, my co-programmer disabled it to test something and didn't re-enable it when he checked in his codes, so it shipped without it. Otherwise, I could have detected everybody who played the game and had a ripped-off CD for Rush 2049 and the Dreamcast.
Thank you.
Yes?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had any interesting anecdotes about developing Centipede. something we'd never heard before, or a tidbit. Thanks.
Oh, I have anecdotes about lights games. Oops. It's an anecdote about Centipede. Oh, man. I don't really have many, but, I'll give you one example. You can usually tell when you have a hit in engineering when, 5 or 6 o'clock rolls around and people come up and say, "Are you going home soon?" Read into it that I'd like to play your game, get lost. So, and that happened certainly to Asteroids, Centipede, and Gauntlet, but rarely to the other games that just did so-so. Yes.
First of all, I just wanted to thank you for making, I think, one of the greatest games of all time. I mean, really. I just want to tell you, I remember being an 11-year-old kid, and my parents had taken me on a trip to Switzerland, and I'd seen this Gauntlet game. It was magical, and my parents could not understand why their son didn't want to go skiing or go outside, but kept going back indoors to this pizza shop, and it's because of you. So, but my question is, I remember ports for the Commodore 64. I think there was an Apple port. Can you speak a little bit to, your involvement in porting across various systems?
All right, this slide says that I had nothing to do with consumer versions. And some of that is intentional, I think, by the other team, because I'm a very stickler for details and I give them shit about anything that's wrong. And early on in Atari days, I would see like in Asteroids, they'd ship Asteroids and I go look and I say, holy crap, they ruined my game. How do they do this? And so, I gave them shit. And eventually we got to actually review stuff. But no, I did not have to do a lot of consumer stuff. And I don't have anything to do with it. Yes?
How large was the game? How much space did it take up? What was your audio compression like and so on?
Just a second. I have this cheat sheet. I have the memory map for Gauntlet. EPROMs. Oh, and a 512-byte EPROM was non-volatile. That was for the operating system, I think. Let's see. Oh, man. 176K words? Wow. 32K bytes for the OS and 16K bytes for Slapstick. That can't be the program ROM. It wasn't that big. So I'd have to say I don't know without actually getting in and trying to figure that out. I could probably look, I could probably go up and, look at the picture. We'll count the EEPROMs. I don't remember if they're 27 128s or 256s, so I can't tell you. But I'd look at that picture, go to the archive and start counting EEPROMs, and I don't know if there are 27 256s or not.
So it might be about a megabyte.
Well, some of those are graphics. So, the motion object, playfield, and alphanumeric. So there's playfield graphics, there's also motion object graphics, there's alphanumeric graphics, and there's a program ROM. And so, oh boy, I got somebody telling me I got 6 minutes, okay. But basically that, not all of it is program ROM there. So I can't tell you how much is the program. I'd have to go back and actually take a look at the schematic, which I actually do have here, and try to figure it out. So at this point, I'm going to have to say I'm sorry, I don't know. Yes?
2 questions. So less than 10% of your games really were successful.
Yes.
How many did you make? And 2, why did so many units go to Ireland?
I'm sorry, what was the second question? How come?
Why, you said like 7,500 units around were shipped to the States, and there were like 20, here we go. You said 7,850 units were sent to the US, 1,500 kits mostly for Japan, and 2,250 went to Ireland. Why
Yes.
Ireland?
I can't tell you if all those, we did ship to Europe, so we do have games sold to Europe. And I cannot tell you if those Ireland games got shipped to the US. I cannot also tell you if the games were built in Ireland because our Milpitas factory was maxed out at 100 games and we needed another 50 or 100, 25 or whatever in Ireland to be shipped back to the East Coast simply to get all the orders in. And I can tell you that the initial US release was 10,000, and I think Ireland was supposed to be 500 to 1,000. But if you add the two numbers together, it does look like, they did try to ramp both of them up just to get all the production in. How many games did I do? I think I did 12 coin-op games in my years from 78 to 92 or so. How many of those were really hits? I'd say 3 of them were really monster hits. It would be Asteroid, Centipede, and Gauntlet. All the others were, good for the time. Some of them were so-so and didn't do as well as I'd like. Yes?
So, thanks for Gauntlet. So Gauntlet, to my knowledge, is one of the first, if not the first, digital game to have differentiated gameplay in which the multiple players couldn't do all of the same things. Can you speak about both the process by which you determined what the balance would be between the 4 different classes, and separately, do you have any data as to which classes were played more or less? Because not every game had 4 players at all times.
Yeah. I'll answer the second question. I thought the Hulk and the Wizard were the most powerful characters, but other people said that the Elf can also be used to play the whole thing. No one and I cannot tell you, I have not seen anybody do the Elf, but I've seen people do the Hulk and the Wizard and play for as long as they need to. As far as the balance goes, I can tell you the Valkyrie was supposed to be an equal balance. I know the Wizard was supposed to be all magic and basically took lots of damage if he got hit, so he was supposed to be the guy in reserve, who sort of hung in the back. And the Elf was the greedy bastard who ran around and grabbed all the food and treasure. So if you wanted a high score, you grabbed the Elf. And the Hulk was a guy who's could sit there and take the damage, and he was the guy who shoved out in front to take care of all the stuff. So that was pretty much how the 4 characters came about. I cannot tell you why I picked those particular 4, but I did try to balance it as such from that. And I'd like to preface it somewhat else that you can thank me all you want for these games, but guys, I was doing this because I like doing games. I was doing this for me too. And there was another reason too, and I didn't get to that slide, and that is Atari had a bonus program, and this is something that unfortunately I wish all companies had done. So what they did is actually rewarded us for games that actually sold and made profit for the company. So we actually had a piece of the profits. And the company actually distributed it to the team, and they actually allowed the team to distribute which people got what. So,
For students that are
wait a minute, just hold one second. Do we have time for more questions? Okay, excellent, good, fire away.
For students that are trying to come into this industry, what do you think is the biggest takeaway or the most important thing that they should learn from the early era, the golden age of arcade and early video games?
Oops,
Oh, there it is.
I ran off the screen. How do you do that? So PowerPoint has a wraparound to the screen of death? Well, anyway, I'm not sure I can answer the question because the industry has certainly changed a lot since 78 days, because we had a lot of phrases sort of covered up the summary. You know, people would say, you could play the game with one beer in your hand, you know, that kind of stuff, or, you know, easy to learn, hard to master, you know, that was the classic one. And for me, it was, you know, what you wanted to do is create a game where people walked up, looked at it, and said, I know what to do. You don't have to read the rules, give them instruction. And for an arcade game, that's absolutely necessary, because there is no instruction booklet, folks. There's no manual that says, here's a help menu, read it all. You just put it up, put your quarter in. If you didn't figure it out, and you didn't think you could figure it out, you just walked away. But all great games, people would walk up, take one look, and say, I know what to do. It's a shooter, whap the shit out of anything that moves, or, come on, that's the way it works. And if you didn't get that initial thing, then, you know, you really didn't get their money, you didn't get their interest, and so you couldn't get their money. The other part of it was you had to make it sure that it had strategic, you know, it had, in my opinion, my games, I always wanted to make sure that it appeared to be lots of strategies, whether it's Asteroid, Centipede, or there would be many different things, like how can I do this? Should I, you know, do this, or should I do that? And so you want to put in coins to try different strategies, find out ones that work. And those are to me, I have the great games that have different strategies. So I hope I answered their question that well. Yes?
Hi, thanks for the great talk and the great game. Can you say a little bit about the process of designing the game, and then, you know, we test all the time, and I don't know if you were able to even do that back then. Like, how often did you play the game to see how it worked and change it and test it? Or did you just make a whole design document and then go from there? What was it like?
How did I decide? Well, let me give you a little story. My first game at Atari was Super Breakout. And I remember going home, falling asleep at night, and playing Progressive Breakout in my sleep. So yes, I played the game a lot. And I remember, oh yeah, and it's like, oh God damn, I died. And after a few years of this, I no longer played the games in my sleep. But yes, we do play a lot of the games. A lot of times it's, you know, testing this particular feature that I stuck in, or, you know, it's making sure I didn't break anything. And yes, we do play it in the lab just before we send it out in field test. And by the way, yes, we still had bugs. And in coin-op games, you basically, that's it. It's shipped, it's got the bugs, it's too late, and that's the way it is. One more question, I'm sorry. Fire away.
You mentioned that you believe that the Hulk and the Wizard were the most powerful classes. Did you ever consider, or wish you had considered, nerfing them?
I'm sorry, doing what with it? I didn't hear the question, so I didn't know what the joke was.
Did you consider like making the Hulk and the Wizard weaker?
You know, I don't have any regrets over that. You know, it's okay to have different characters or different things, especially on Gauntlet 2, where you could pick whatever character you wanted to be in any position. And that was one of the great parts about Gauntlet 2, and I wish I had done that in Gauntlet, is to let you pick your character. So thank you very much, folks. I appreciate it. And I will stay a little bit here if anybody has any questions. I will answer them.